Hey guys, it's Liv here, and today I want to discuss the new, for some reason this has been going around, and I don't know why it has. Well, okay, I get why it has, but I hate that it has been. Shed Shell Dondozo. What if it worked? In this case, we're not entertaining the idea if it does or doesn't work, because it doesn't work, but I'm going over the hypothetical. What if Shed Shell Dondozo did work in VGC? If you enjoy this discussion, you want to see some more like it, like and subscribe for more, and answer the comment question of the day. Would you use Shed Shell Dondozo if it was possible in VGC? And let me know down below if why or why not. And with that said, let's get started on the discussion. So essentially, this boils down to a tweet that started going around a couple days ago. Someone actually tagged me in this. Our good pal Rao tagged me, essentially asking the question. Well, this tweet asks the question, I guess, is Shed Shell Dondozo an actual viable pick? And if it's even possible for that matter. Spoiler alert, it is not possible. I had multiple people test this both in-game and on Showdown. It's not possible. But this tweet mentioned something about how someone had played against Shed Shell Dondozo and how Dozo was just switching in and out, in and out, in and out, and getting boosts, and how there might be potential there. And I think there would be potential there. But again, I'll go into the why a little bit in the video. But then this did spawn another tweet actually right afterwards, where someone had quote tweeted this and said, using Shed Shell let Tatsugiri switch out from Dondozo, but it does work. However, you actually go -4 in all stats because of the extra effort to vomit up the Tatsugiri. So not only are we actually going to be going over if Dondozo could use Shed Shell today, but we're also going to actually break down the hypothetical of what if Tatsugiri could use Shed Shell? And I do think that this actually does bring up a very different hypothetical going over both of these. I think if, depending on which mod it was legal on, or if it was possible on both actually, there's a whole different slew of things that could or might not change in this format, depending on what actually could be a thing. So I guess let's get started with Tatsugiri. What if Tatsugiri was the one that was able to switch out? So in the hypothetical that Shed Shell and Tatsugiri, for one, I'm not gonna go over the fucking -4 thing, because I'll let you know right now if this was actually a thing. So Topsy Turvy is not in the game on any Pokemon, and as far as contrary skill swap or whatever, I think it's like entrainment is the move. Like there's nothing that would actually make this possible without having to chain some ridiculous amount of Pokemon. So we're not going to entertain the -4 thing. But what if Tatsugiri could actually switch out with the Shed Shell? So for one, I feel like we would have already actually seen this in the format. But two, I think that one of the best things you could actually pair with this would probably be something like a Gothitelle. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for this, but for one, it starts off with the fact that at the very least, well, actually, maybe not Gothitelle, you'd probably actually see this with some sort of Follow Me Pokemon. Specifically, I think we'd actually see this with something such as Indeedee. Now, I think that how this would end up playing out would be you would see Follow Me Indeedee. It would probably on this sort of archetype go for some sort of resistance to ice, so you'd probably be seeing like a Terra Steel Indeedee, or you might end up seeing probably not a Terra Ice. You might see Terra Fire actually, could be another one. I think though ultimately this would probably end up being Terra Steel. Terra Steel would give you a check to, in theory at least, potential other side spams, barring the fact that Armors could go for fire moves, but at least it would help with dealing with spread moves. You would be able to redirect a lot of common ways of beating Dondozo. This would be stuff like Flower Trick from Scarlet, for example. You would also be able to follow me away stuff like, for example, Freeze Try on Iron Bundle. So it would essentially give another element to what Dondozo would usually do to tear around threats, but instead you would be focusing this more on the redirection aspect. And I think you would probably even pair this with multiple redirectors. However, I think Indeedee would be the best because unlike something such as a Rage Powder or Amoonguss, despite Amoonguss probably being a little bit better of a partner naturally, Indeedee wouldn't have the safety goggles issue, which is something that Rage Powder or Amoonguss would have, as well as with grass types, which Dondozo already struggling with grasses. It's honestly a pretty big red flag there. You could obviously just go for order ups on grasses. However, stuff like Flower Masquerada or Abomasnow in general would already pose a big enough threat to where I do think that ultimately Indeedee would be the best partner for this. You'd probably throw on something like a safety goggles to stop from sporing at the least, and you'd probably go with Follow me, you'd probably go with Helping Hand, you'd probably go with Protect, and then probably some sort of offensive move, or maybe like Heal Pulse actually could be interesting. You could even ditch Helping Hand actually for Heal Pulse and turn this into like a really filthy support piece. You'd probably go with like Dazzling Gleam, or actually something that might be more viable would be Psychic here. The Psychic would specifically actually be for something like an Amoonguss matchup. In an open sheet, you might be able to force a really unholy Terra, or something that just wouldn't really have a place in a matchup, just to resist that Psychic hit. Which would be something like a Terra Dark, for example, or maybe like a Terra Steel, which at least Terra Steel Dozo could just Earthquake through, which would be easy. But against both archetypes, as well as even if it was like a Terra Dark, Steel, or potentially if it was something that could resist like a Dazzling Gleam, or just become neutral, typically unless it was like a Terra Water, Dozo would probably be favoring it more because you could just go for Wave Crash onto it. But even still, you could just go for, in most cases, Order Up and just use Indeedee to redirect any sort of powder attacks, or specifically the Spores really would be the big thing. But ultimately, I think Indeedee would be a fantastic partner, specifically, of course, with the Shed Shell on Tatsugiri. This implies, again, that this wouldn't be the -4 thing, because I think the -4 thing outright just goes into outlandishly terrible territory. It would never actually be a net positive to switch out Tatsugiri at that point, because you would always be clinging from the back. Now, I will say the one exception will be is if you were planning to switch out both Pokemon, but you would essentially need to always click Protect on Dondozo and then switch back in. Well, you need to switch out afterwards yet again, which kind of just leads to the point where you would need two really fantastic back walls to actually be taking that hit to consistently bring in Dozokiri. And at that point, I think it would be more of a hindrance even still. Even if it was possible, I think you'd be losing too much if it was -4. However, without the -4 being a thing, if it was just the fact that you kept your boosts and you could continuously cycle, I think there would be actual merit in doing this, even if it was just to try and keep Tatsugiri around to try and reset the boost against Haze Pokemon. I think we'd also see a huge surge specifically for opposing matchups in Haze users. I think especially with the Terra Steel Dozo being an option on this sort of set, whether it was Shed Shell or otherwise, you wouldn't really be able to actually make it work as far as clear smogging, because Steel Dozo would be fucking insane. So as far as viable Haze Pokemon go, we'd probably see one of the biggest upticks would be something like Vaporeon with Water Absorb, and then going with like a Terra Fairy set, just to try and wall out the Order Up as well as walling out the Wave Crash, forcing opponents to maybe go for something like an Earthquake or even a Terra Blast, I guess at that point, would probably be a viable option on Dondozo for these Haze Terra Fairy Vaporeons. But you could also actually make a case for a Terra Steel, or even just some sort of resistance to Dragon. That would also be, you wouldn't have a lot of options for that actually, because Terra, you would essentially be going for either Steel or Fairy, I think, of Vaporeon with this sort of archetype, and then going for Haze, and essentially just trying to beat Dondozo that way, or more than likely would be Palafin. I think Haze Palafin's already a pretty decent option on it with just mono water attacks, and I think we'd still see it for sure. Specifically to combat the fact that Tatsugiri could continuously set boosts again. This would be something that I think Haze Palafin would actually be pretty well versed in checking, because it's a fairly bulky water type. You could, in theory, at the very least, just keep going for Haze on Dondozo and stop it from keeping boosts up. Especially on like a Tailwind build where you just outpace +2 Dozo anyway, Palafin would actually be a pretty decent Haze user. If we were to look at a Clear Smog, while I do think it would be objectively a lot worse, you would still have obviously a Amoonguss would probably be one of the best users, as well as Brute Bonnet would again be a phenomenal user. However, if we're looking to other Clear Smog users, we don't really have a lot else that would be viable. We might see the rise in like Clear Smog and Gastrodon, but I think again, if you were running the Water Absorb set with Gastrodon, you would just go with Vaporeon at that point. Because I think especially if you have to worry about continuous setting a Dozo, that Terra Steel Dozo would probably be the objective best Terra type there, with I guess Grass being the second best, though I don't know why you would really not just go with a Redirect or like a Safety Goggles Amoonguss at that point, and go with like a Terra Steel Dozo, because I think that would objectively be the best case scenario there. And I think it would be really actually objectively broken. Dozo, I think, despite the fact that Order Up is now fixed, would still objectively be seeing a net positive, to where Dozo would actually be like a very incredibly viable Pokemon. And it's not to say that Dozo isn't great right now. In fact, if we pull up usage stats of Dondozogiri, if we pull up on the Showdown ladder, Dondozo is currently sitting at about 21% usage. If we compare this to the Series 2 rankings on Switch, Dondozo is 21st overall. And if we compare this to tournament usage, Dondozo is sitting at about 12.57% usage, at least as the Bochum Regionals, with Knoxville, of course. Dondozo is about 9.8. And for Oceania will be the last stat that I check for recent Dondozo, of course. Dondozo is about 18.9. So Dondozo's still seeing incredible usage, but I think we genuinely would be talking about Dondozo as like a top 5 or 10 Pokemon if this was the case. Specifically with the fact that you could switch out Tatsugiri without any sort of drawback on the stat boost. I think, however, when we get into the discussion of if Dondozo could switch out, this gets a lot more complicated because I think that Dondozo actually hurts a lot more from switching out, if that makes sense, for a few different reasons, actually. For one, if you switch out Tatsugiri, you can actually still attack with Dondozo that turn. However, by switching out Dondozo instead, you do kind of gain a no attacking spot, and I think this would actually be a lot more balanced. Specifically, by switching out Dondozo, you've rid yourself of the stat boost, and you can never actually exceed +2 unanimously by doing this, which is something that by Tatsugiri switching out, you could do. So I think Tatsugiri, objectively speaking, would be the better mon to be able to benefit from this. However, I think that's why they locked Tatsugiri from making any sort of move here and forcing you to stay in, because if they even gave the intention to switch out and just said that like it failed or something, or like made you go for an attack but it failed, by allowing Tatsugiri to switch out at the very least with a Shed Shell, you could essentially circumvent the fact that Tatsugiri never actually even gets to click a button, and you could switch it out and then infinitely boost Dozo. And I think that at least does lead to a really bad snowball. However, by forcing Dondozo to be the only Pokemon to take advantage of this, Dondozo could never at least outpace, or never exceed +2 unanimously Omnia boosting, which at least gives you some sort of hard cap on this. Now, that's not to say that being able to continuously reset order ups, commander boosts is exactly a competitive thing, but it's a lot better than being able to utilize the ability to boost further than +2 with this by going for like a +4 Omni boost or a +6 Omni boost, or just continuously circumventing Haze. Dondozo at the very least could still get around the stuff like the Haze drops, which is cool. There would still actually be merit in this specifically for those Haze or Clear Smog Pokemon. On top of this as well, it would be great to get around potential Rocky Helmet users like a Mungus that could otherwise just try and draw in Dozo. Especially if you're not running a Terra Grass set to try and get around Rage Powders, this would have a lot of merit in my opinion. But I think that ultimately one of the best benefits that you do get from Dozo switching out is the fact that against Pokemon that you can't really touch, or against builds that would otherwise guarantee KO, stuff like a bundle build, for example, you could actually get around not having to Terra Dozo. And I think that's where one of the biggest benefits of this happens, is you could actually save your Terrestrial for other Pokemon. Now, it's not to say that Dozo is a terrible Terra user, but I would like to think of Dozo as really like the last case scenario Terramon on a team, to where you kind of need to commit with Dozo being your win con if you're going to Terra it. And I think we're past the point of Dozo actually being a really strong win con. I feel like a lot of people have circumvented counterplay for Dondozo, whether it's through Hail Cores, Iron Bundle in general. We have Clear Smog for non-Terra Steel sets, we have Helmet of Mungus for non-Terra Grass sets. We have a lot of built-in archetypes that can handle Dondozo, or even just out-offense it, unless you're running really like heavily physically leading teams, which I feel like no one's really doing anymore to the extent that you would actually be having a Dozo issue in your matchups. I feel like a lot of teams just have counterplay for Dozo at this point. So I don't know if we'd really get into a scenario where you should be tearing Dozo, because I feel like every Terra type in Dozo actually has a lot more matchup issues. For example, Terra Steel Dozo has a lot bigger issues against Pokemon like Great Tusk and also Size Spam even, because you would be now pressured severely more easily by Armor Cannon Armors, for example. On top of this as well, with Terra Grass, you're still having the issue with stuff like Size Spam Cores, but you're also having an issue by being able to be Clear Smogged, because Mungus would typically run Pollen Puff, which would still also be a new super effective option. And despite the fact that you would be able to obviously get around stuff like Rage Powder and Spore, at the same time, you would risk the exceptions where Mungus might have Clear Smog for you, or you could, in theory, risk other Pokemon having it, like Gastrodon at the very least. So I think that it's a real give and take. Dozo's not really running Terra to get Terra Blast coverage or gain a new stab. Occasionally it's running Dragon for that, but it's such an uncommon thing at this point in the metagame. Terra Flying's another one where, again, you're defensively using it for Flower Trick, but you're still weak to Bundle is an issue with that, and you burned a Terra slot on a Pokemon that's still going to lose to one of the best offensive responses for you, being Freeze Dry and Bundle. So I feel like at a certain point we need to ask ourselves, if Dondozo could switch, would you even actually have a reason to Terrestrial it anymore? And I would actually argue that you would almost never Terrestrial Dozo at that point anymore. Again, we're shifting away from Dozo being a Terramon to begin with. It's still not a bad one, but I think, again, it's a lot less common at this point. And I think that realistically, we would actually start to see partners with Dondozo Terra. This would be stuff like your Size Spams, your Fluttermanes and Iron Moths, and you would almost never actually see Dozo running a Terra type in any given scenario. It would be something that truly would be probably your weakest Terra type on a team, because even Tatsugiri at that point might benefit a bit more. I think you would still definitely see Choice Scarf Tatsugiri if Dozo could Shed Shell out, because essentially you would need to make sure that Dondozo was never actually going for was never actually going to be running the Terra. It would be Tatsugiri. I think, though, actually one thing that would benefit the most is you would actually be running a lot of Focus Sash Tatsugiri at that point. Focus Sash Tatsugiri would be pretty beneficial, actually, as you would need to make sure that Tatsugiri was going to be able to switch out, stay alive continuously. That's why I think that Tatsugiri, being the Shed Shell user and not Dondozo, would be significantly more broken. Again, the game isn't even coded for that to be possible, but I think if it was, that Tatsugiri would objectively always be the Shed Shell mon, because you would want to make sure that Dondozo is the one staying in, because it's the one that can actually be bulky enough to take these hits. Despite them both having huge issues with a lot of similar Pokemon, like Free Strike Bundle, for example, I think that in the end, at least Dondozo could benefit from maybe clicking Protect on that spot, and it's not something that Tatsugiri would really want to do, and it's not Choice Scarf, it's not Focus Sash. And I think that Choice Scarf Tatsugiri as well is definitely an item that if either Pokemon could run Shed Shell, would actually tank severely in usage. Now, that's not to say that both these Pokemon would even actually run Shed Shell. We do need to discuss, is it worth running Shed Shell in these Pokemon? I think on a lot of archetypes it would be. I think it'd open up Dondozo to be a lot more splashable on teams that weren't essentially running 3 core structures. But at the same time though, does Dondozo actually need it? If we look at a lot of Series 2 teams, I can pull up some Dondozo builds. But as far as other teams go, for example, I think if we look at a lot of these teams, really none of them actually would appreciate running Dondozo with Shed Shell. If I had to pick a team that would benefit from it, I think it would be the Liberty Note team that I have here. And it's not to say that there aren't others that would not run Shed Shell, if that makes sense. But for example, if we look at it, for example, Freeze-Eyes team. Freeze-Eyes team, if we're really considering the Shed Shell Dondozo, why would Dondozo not actually just run Leftovers in this build? Essentially, it's meant to be like a really good Dozo endgame. And what would you actually gain by switching into mons like Volcarona, for example, or Annihilate and letting it take more damage, or Fluttermane and Mousehold? You would, if anything, you could get some merit out of running Shed Shell on Tatsugiri here, and I think that would be an argument to be had, is maybe switching out Tatsugiri into Pokemon like Mousehold, for example, boosting the Dondozo and getting the Follow Me support. There would be a discussion to be had there, and I think that would actually be a fairly viable argument to be making. However, I think there's no case where Dozo would ever actually run a Shed Shell on this team, and I think it's another kind of big issue here, is Dondozo, if Dondozo was the only one that could run the Shed Shell, I don't think there's any team that would actually care. Now, there's reasons you would actually switch out Dondozo, specifically to free up Tatsugiri to do some more damage, but I don't think the net positive would be worth it, and I think ultimately you would actually lose it in a lot of scenarios to where you would prefer Leftovers, or you'd prefer Chesto Berry. But Tatsugiri, on the other hand, I think could actually make the case. Tatsugiri would in general be a fairly good option to switch out on this team, and I think that pretty much any sort of Choice Scarf build would, in most cases, switch to Shed Shell. However, I think there's certain Sash builds that might not. Like, for example, I think in this team, there's a case to be made that... Well, actually, I think this team would probably be the best case scenario, because you could switch into Pokemon like Dragonite with Multiscale, or Defiant. Kingambit, I think, would be the big one here with the Salt Vest, to where you would have actual defensive options. But I think ultimately, though, Dozo wouldn't actually benefit a lot from this. Now, I think the biggest benefit would just be to reset the boosts. Like, in a scenario where it was either you could never switch out to Dondozo, or you could run Shed Shell, and you would at least have the ability to gain boosts yet again in the game. I think there's certain matchups where against specific matchups, really, Amoonguss focused teams that were really weak to Amoonguss that might have Pokemon like Volk in the back would probably be really the only situations where you would actually switch out. So like on the Freeze-Eye build, for example, where you have the Volcarona, or on this build right here where you have the Iron Moth, which really all of these have Volk or Iron Moth, you might switch into those specifically against Amoonguss teams that had Clear Smog, but it's no longer even a common move on Amoonguss. You're typically seeing Pollen Buff, Protect, Spore, and Rage Powder as the 4 definitive most common options. But I think that you wouldn't really switch it out against most Amoonguss teams unless they had Clear Smog, and I think it's the only Pokemon you'd actually switch out Dozo for anyway. So I think that Dozo wouldn't actually care. I think there's better options like Covert Cloak, Leftovers, Chesto Berry that all at least would have a lot more consistency here. Tatsugiri, though, I think would objectively make this core broken. I think that there's a huge reason for not allowing Tatsu to switch to begin with, or even allow it to fail switching to begin with, because of the fact that if you gave it Shed Shell, Tatsu would actually be a really broken option for this. Allowing Dozo to keep the stat boost while still gaining an actual valuable partner, it's a lot of the logic of people switched up to Toxicroak at the beginning of the season with. But the difference here is that you would have Tatsugiri to actually be a viable Pokemon later on. I think specifically one of the biggest archetypes that would also gain a lot of usage, Indeedee is a huge one. Indeedee would be one of the best partners for Dondozo at that point. But I think another Pokemon that would be really sought after would be actually Talonflame. Talonflame Dondozo would be so fucking huge. because it's less for Dozo actually. Dozo would benefit from the tailwind, sure, but it'd be to get the speed boost back on Tatsugiri, because typically teams are running Choice Scarf to allow Tatsugiri to really quickly Icy Wind past Pokemon. But in this sort of build, you could actually make a case for late game Tatsugiri plus Talonflame being a really big threat. And by allowing Talonflame to boost Tatsugiri to just Icy Wind spam through teams, while also having the Focus Sash Tatsugiri to make sure you're getting up the Icy Wind guaranteed against a lot of Pokemon, there's a really big discussion to be had about, would this actually be a really good archetype? And I think the answer would be yes. I think definitively if you were, actually you wouldn't be, on this sort of archetype, you'd be running the Shed Shell. But even still, if you had the Shed Shell on this, of course, you would be able to just obviously take advantage of the fact that you could end up making sure that this has Shed Shell twice, Showdown, fix that. You would be able to essentially making sure that you could switch out Tatsugiri and bring in Pokemon like Talonflame, get a Tailwind, and then just start cleaning with Dozo late game, or cleaning with Tatsu late game. And I think that would be a huge actual snowball for a lot of teams. You can get stuff like Spread Muddy Water and Icy Wind to clear through teams at +2, while still having made sure that you broke them enough with Dondozo plus Talonflame or Dondozo plus Indeedee, and honestly perform a really competent archetype that would have a lot of issues. In terms of a lot of things that would even threaten, like if you run Indeedee with Side Spam, for example, with that, and throw in like Armarouge, Indeedee, Talonflame, Tatsugiri, Dondozo, and Filler, sure, you would have some issues with certain Pokemon, like for example, Ruins would be a bit of an issue, but what Ruin actually would threaten this really well? I think that really just the defensive ones, like for example, Wo-Chien could be a bit of an issue, but you'd have Side Spam for that. Tinglu could be a bit of an issue, but you'd have Wo-Chien for that, unless it's Terragrass Tinglu, which fuck Terragrass Tinglu, that would actually be kind of a threat. But you could still order up past it and be actually threatening. As far as the offensive ones though, Chi-Yu would never really be a threat for this core, and Wo-Chien would just, and Chien-Pao would never actually threaten this either. So I think that realistically, I think that any weakness that Side Spam would have had, Dozo could actually threaten it. And I think any weakness that, well, any reason to not run Talonflame that you would have had would be mitigated by the fact that you would obviously have the Shed Shell and Tatsugiri. So I think you could actually see those Side Spam cores with like Talonflame, Tatsugiri, Dondozo, and then like Sixmon, probably like a great Tusk, or really just any sort of good partner, like a Flutter Mane. Kinkamba would have some merit too, or really just any good Dark type could be valuable just to handle opposing Dark matchups. This might be Chi-Yu in all honesty, though Triple Fire sounds a little sus. I think realistically it'd probably be like one of Bonnet, Roaring Moon, Wo-Chien, or not Wo-Chien. If you want a Bonnet, Kinkambit, or Roaring Moon, I think it would be in that spot. You could maybe make a merit for Hydreigon as well. But ultimately, though, I think you could have a lot of merit. And I think that one of the biggest benefits would truly be the Side Spam cores with Dondozo. I think it's by far the peak of what Shed Shell would benefit with you. But let me know if there's other options that you think I've missed down below. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see some more discussions like this, let me know in the comments. And I would love to try and answer any questions that you guys might have, or any hypotheticals that you guys might have. In general, I thought this was a really funny one, and I was going to consider making an actual vid showcasing it. However, a lot of people told me that it wasn't an actual thing, which is a little unfortunate, but it is what it is. Shout out to channel members, of course, being Josh K. Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Matt O'Shea, Bebot, Anna DePer, and Timo Mueller. You guys' support on the channel is greatly appreciated. And if you want to become a channel member today, just a couple dollars a month. We have some bonus content going up tomorrow for you guys, so make sure to stay tuned for that. And then we'll have another one going up on a couple Saturdays from now, where we'll be on time with our channel member video going up on the 25th. But I'll see you guys then. Otherwise, peace out, guys.